and good afternoon, and welcome to this webcast on transparency, and in particular what more can be done to help institutional investors achieve what they say that they want to achieve in terms of obtaining greater transparency in hedge fund investing. I'd like to welcome you all to this webcast from a rainy Millennium Hotel, or rainy outside anyway, in central London. I believe that there are a number of you who responded to the research survey that we conducted late last year on this subject, and thank you again for participating in the study. So, without further ado, I'm going to first introduce the panel we have here today to discuss the results, and then, as I say, I'm going to go through what we think are the main findings of the study. On my furthest right, we have Phil Masterson, who is Managing Director and Head of Thought Leadership, Investment Manager Services at SEI. He's based in the US, but has come over to London this week, partly to participate in this discussion this afternoon. And on my immediate right here is Steve McGowan, who is Head of Managed Accounts Lifecycle within the multi-manager group, if I've got that right, at Man Investments. On my immediate left is David Woodhouse. He is Chief Due Diligence Officer at Fouchier Partners, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is also another major fund-to-fund manager in the industry. And on my furthest left is Dermot Butler, who's Chairman of Custom House, which is a fund administrator based in Dublin. And I'd like to thank both Custom House and SEI for the support they've given to this particular project.
Thank you for having us here. There were some very good quotes actually in that survey that you provided us a brief intro to there, and one of the ones that I thought struck home was the fact that people have always been looking for transparency. We refer to 08 as almost a point when that transparency has actually started to become more widely available. And I think that's important to note, actually a catalyst and a realignment of the interests of the investors with the disclosures from the managers. Key to all of this, of course, is what data you're looking for, what are you able to do with that data, that's where this is something that Man, of course, has been pretty instrumental in with respect to building our controls around capturing that data, around using it to create a better asset allocation process and output to investors, but also to ensure that the control which you are able to exert on your money which has been invested is appropriate for what you need.
Yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Just for anyone who doesn't know Fouchier, we're a fund of hedge funds. Been in business since 1995, we've got about 8 billion of assets, and most of our clients are institutional. Conscious of time, perhaps I could just make some comments under 4 headings as quickly as I can. I think the first point is that transparency is very much a hold-all term. I think it is useful to think of transparency in slightly different buckets where there are different tensions and different dynamics going on. There's obviously transparency over the actual investment portfolio. There's transparency over operations and procedures. There's transparency over valuation, where obviously things like the FAS levels, now the ASC levels have made a difference. Some of those.
So the FAS levels, can you?
The US accounting standards has now been adopted also under international standards where, sensible investors have always asked these questions anyway of managers in terms of, the difficulty of valuing assets. For several years now it's been enshrined. The administrators will be very familiar with this and can talk about this, and many of them are asked to provide monthly reporting now on those levels. But you now have an auditor/administrator sign off on the difficulty of valuation over the assets. So that's an area we can perhaps talk about. That's an example of where transparency in that area, distinct things have happened in recent years, partly because of investor pressure, partly because of accounting standards enshrining certain minimum standards. Then you've got something that was already alluded to by Philip, the area of existence of assets, which is obviously topical, page made off, but I think sensible investors have always been asking questions about that and about counterparty risk. And then I think it was alluded to in your research what I would call business transparency, and that often the most sensitive area of that is frankly questions about money. How much does the manager have invested alongside his investors? How does the remuneration work? This is another topical subject, of course, given recent regulations and politics. So that's one point. I think it's sometimes useful to break transparency down to those kind of buckets. Second point I'd like to make, I'm conscious I'm probably talking for too long, but shut me up, Simon, when you're ready. I do agree very much with the points Steve made on the history of these things. I think it's easy to fall into this caricature that things, we lived in a sort of prelapsarian world before 2008 and everything changed overnight there. And I think sensible managers and sensible investors have always had this dialogue. And I think sensible managers accept that they should meet reasonable transparency demands. The question always is, what is reasonable? And I appreciate there is no doubt that the events of 2008 meant that investors had more leverage over managers in that regard. But I think it would be a mistake to say no one cared about these things before 2008, now everybody does. That is a caricature, I think. If I could just come on to the dynamic quickly between managers and investors, and of course we, as a fund of hedge funds, like Steve, face both sides of these things. I'll come on to funds of hedge funds in my last point. I think from the manager's point of view, there are some legitimate things that they worry about. Confidentiality is obviously very important, particularly in relation to portfolio transparency. I think also they have a compliance issue in terms of treating all clients fairly. So I think it is a good rule of thumb that if you're going to give something to one investor, you should give to all. The more cynical corollary of that is that certain managers may not trust some of their investors as much as they trust others, and therefore the investors that they do trust might suffer if they have a blanket policy. So I can see from the manager's point of view, they don't want a situation philosophically where they give someone one thing and not the same thing to another person. In practice, of course, that does happen because of the dynamic between investors and managers.
And sorry, can I interrupt you? That's a very, very important point. But I think that's illegal in the United States, isn't it?
Well, we could spend the hour talking about that. In that there are obviously regulations about treating clients fairly, not just in the United States, in the UK, in any sort of reputable domicile. The interpretation of that, in terms of how proactive you have to be, how information is made available, I think, is very wide-ranging. It depends who you listen to and who's doing the interpreting. Okay, but clearly the principle is that any investor in a pooled vehicle should not be at a disadvantage. I mean, that is the principle we all adhere to and agree to. From the investor's point of view, I think clearly what they ask for depends to an extent on their size and prestige and what the manager is prepared to do for them. I think there has to be a level of common sense in terms of this point that's been raised in your study a few times about how far do you push. Obviously everyone should have minimum levels of transparency. They're not prepared to breach under any circumstances, but I think in real life there is a little bit of pragmatism depending on the individual dynamic. Just finally, I'm sorry I've talked for too long, but the point about fund of hedge funds, I would actually disagree with you.
Good, I like this bit of the debate.
I don't know what other people think, but certainly I think our investors have always asked sensible questions and made sensible demands of us, and I think we are, in theory, it's the investor's prerogative to ask those questions, and we're happy to answer them. I think the only and funds of hedge funds have less, I think, confidentiality concerns than underlying ones. I think the only two things that we would worry about and where we would sort of draw some lines, if necessary, are clearly if we're gaining capacity to a young manager we think is very good, we don't want that plastered everywhere, so people might not actually think us being invested is a recommendation, but they could then just get a free ride on the research we've done. And secondly, clearly funds of hedge funds in their own due diligence work perform an awful lot of, funny enough, gaining transparency to these managers, have access to an awful lot of confidential information. be it on the portfolio, be it on the individuals. Of course, we all do background checks on the individuals, be it on the sensitive financial issues. And I think it is only because the underlying managers trust us on not giving that information out to other people, whether deliberately or inadvertently, that we get that information in the first place. But with those two caveats, I think responsible funds and hedge funds, are very happy to service investors' requests, and it's the investors' prerogative to ask questions.
Dermot.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of points. I totally agree with the comment about treating investors the same, but David did only once mention, and nobody else mentioned, within a pooled vehicle. I mean, obviously investors aren't treated the same in a fund and a managed account. I personally have, I was surprised the other day when I was reading part of the Madoff case that the Americans have an attitude to accountants, or approach to accountants, which that accountants should maintain a certain level of skepticism, which I thought was rather a good phrase, which was obviously totally missed out in that particular case. But I do think it does apply in my feeling as far as NDAs go. I think they're almost, they're written in such a way that you can get out of them fairly easily, and I'm not sure they're that effective.
Are they not legally binding?
Yeah.
But they're not, or they are?
Oh, they are, yes. But I mean,
how can you get out of them?
Well, you can get out of them because people sometimes just ignore them. I mean, don't forget, the whole of this problem is because there were legally binding contracts that people ignored.
I think the problem with NDA, it's a bit like the control issues over managed accounts. If you breach a managed account agreement, the problem with NDAs is they are, of course, legally binding, but the damage is usually done before you can get your redress in law. The question of what your damages are is one question. You'll get an injunction probably too late to stop the damage being done. So my experience of managers who've had a leak, if you like, and had information they don't like to be made public, is that once the damage is done, there's little point, frankly, in going down the legal route, unless you think the investor or whoever it was has let you down so badly you just want to nail them.
Well, you can get a lot more money. I mean, yes. The other thing is that part of the function of an NDA is, as David was saying, is to stop information getting out. You might breach it and it's got out to Steve, but no point in suing it because then it'll get out in the whole world. And so anyway, all I was trying to say was I have a skepticism towards NDAs anyway. I think that as far as administrators disclosing information to investors, we get investors coming in and seeing us, I wouldn't say daily, but very often. And the sort of information that we will give out without discussing it with anybody else, without getting permission, is exactly how we do what we do. But when it comes down to releasing information on a regular basis about a fund or the performance, one should remember that, in fact, I would disagree with you, that administrators may have been identified initially, and the suggestion that they're hired by the manager, but they're actually hired by the fund, and they have an obligation to the fund and through the board to shareholders, although they have no direct contractual relationship with shareholders. And that, when it comes down to legal punch-ups, is very important. But still, an administrator must make sure that whatever they are doing is within their contract and is approved by the board and the fund. And certainly, giving out information to one shareholder which you don't give out to another is not necessarily illegal, but very close to being illegal.
It is illegal, I think, in theory.
It's under company law. You're not supposed to treat shareholders differently to one shareholder differently to another. Yes, but again, it's one of those things. Are people going to start suing? I don't know. The whole point about transparency, I would suggest, is that I totally agree with David's comment. Transparency has been on the cards for years. People have been discussing it, fighting over whether they should give transparency in portfolio or not. It is merely a part of the whole due diligence process, and like the rest of the due diligence process, should be reviewed on a regular basis. I was mentioning to David before that when a few years ago I was deputy chairman of AIMA, we have had then, and I think still do, AIMA has regular regulatory forums, which are lots of regulators all turn up, they all talk about lots of things with people from the industry, under what's called the Chatham House rules. And on one of those, there was a panel where the discussion of transparency came up. This was in 2006 or 7, not 2008. And it was agreed by the people on the panel who were industry and IMF and the Financial Stability Forum representatives, that as far as transparency goes, what's important is that you have full transparency on procedures, on risk management, on how the administrator does it, but not necessarily the portfolio, because that can be damaging to other shareholders. Now, I think it's in the States, and it may be coming over here, you now have to make reports if you're a manager on what your positions are. It is, of course, confidential, providing one particular who Australian is now speaking the wrong way there, doesn't get hold of it. But nothing is confidential anymore. So that is disclosed. I personally have sympathy for managers who do not wish their portfolio disclosed. I noticed one of the comments in here was we wouldn't mind getting that information if it came later. Now I wonder what use is it, except, and it explained to me about a very good due diligence expert on this panel, that it does show you, even if you're a step behind, if there's been style drift, and that is very important. That's all part of the due diligence. Verification, I agree. And, you know, the verification thing came out of Madoff and also, I think, Petters. The thing that was clear about Madoff wasn't that there wasn't transparency. It was absolutely no due diligence done at all. Or it doesn't appear to have been. I wouldn't like to jump in full course, as I say, but certainly it appears there was no due diligence. And that has been perhaps the one thing that's shaken up the whole attitude to due diligence, and transparency has become the sort of main focus of that. I would agree with Phil, I think it was Phil or Steve, one of their comments, that the problem with transparency is that you have to understand what you're looking at once they open the door and show you. And there was quite a famous case of a manager who I think was Beacon that went down, and there was quite a famous large continental bank that had a very large managed account, and I had no idea what was happening. Well, it didn't appear to have done, they said they did nothing about it. So even some of the strongest institutions sometimes don't understand what's happening when they have transparency. What else? Going into UCITS because of liquidity structure is very odd. If you want the manager to give you liquidity and is prepared to set up a fund as a UCITS to give you liquidity, why doesn't he set up what I call one of the if funds, a PIF or SIF? You can write liquidity into the contract of the fund. And there are lots of funds that I can think of that are really
Simon, if I might just pick up on Dermot's comment there. I think I would agree with that on this QIFs and the SIFs as being a interim step from a private fund, unregistered fund to a UCITS. So we've seen a lot of our clients satisfying their investors' concerns regarding liquidity, but also a little bit additional regulation and also an independent custody. Rather than going to UCITS, they've found a QIF to be satisfactory from their investor perspective.
Can I add something in there as well on liquidity, because we talked about UCITS and liquidity. The key throughout, though, is making sure that the liquidity that is being offered to investors is in fact the liquidity of the portfolio. A very basic statement and a very hopefully obvious statement, but if you look at what is available out there, that's not often the case. And it goes back to the transparency again. It's understanding what it is you are investing in, what it is you have bought. And so it's both understanding the positions that are held and being able to then interpret the liquidity of that portfolio. So I think it is very important. UCITS, you sometimes get UCITS funds that are being made UCITable. I'm not sure if that's just a term I've just invented, but and what you will see is there are carve-outs to that portfolio in order to hit a certain liquidity.
Can I say something a little bit sort of basic and arguably potentially slightly ignorant? But and in a sense I'm trying to represent sort of the views of many of the people that answered this research by asking this question, is that there is, I think, generally a feeling that an institution, many institutions that answer this research, whether they know what to do with the information they get is a completely different matter, but when they were asked what do they want, they said basically, in many cases, they want it all. For whatever reason they do, they said they want it all. And with all due respect to you gentlemen, all of you on this panel so far, I don't sense there is an urgent need in terms of what you're all doing to necessarily provide a lot more. As Steve, I think you said, it's really a question about the balance between confidentiality and disclosure. And if the results of this research are right, and by the way, there have been other studies, I think it was a very good title from the PwC study, it wasn't about transparency, it was their big alternative investment management piece of research last year, and they entitled the big study From Black Box to Open Book, the Future of Hedge Fund Investing. But I sense that there isn't that same urgency amongst your... as if that's...
I'm going to have to disagree with
all right,
you.
go ahead. Yeah.
We can all take it in turns.
Hey, come on, give me... I'll take it on the chin, yeah.
And, I mean, what does all mean? But I mean, for example, portfolio transparency, I think, would be a very good example, where I do think the sort of covenant between underlying hedge fund managers and investors has changed. I think managers are still within their rights to lag a portfolio, redact it, decide how it might be delivered to investors or how investors might inspect it, but I think it is now generally accepted, I think it's fair to say, by reasonable managers and investors, that investors should have some form of portfolio transparency at some form of frequency. Now, of course, there's the whole issue of managed accounts where normally, not always, normally one has that sort of transparency built into the structure. But even outside of those structures, I think that has, progress has definitely been made in that area, and progress has been made by sometimes, very occasionally, because managers, were in distress in 2008, but more because investors have pressed on this point much more. Liquidity would be a very good example of that. Even if you don't get the portfolio every day, if you get it on a frequent basis, you can align or check the statements the manager might be making about liquidity of the portfolio generally.
Okay, that's a fair point.
So I think in that particular area, actually, a lot of progress has been made, and I think in some of the other areas we're talking about, there has definitely been evolution. We've already talked about valuation. The administrators can talk more than me about the initiatives on existence, where I think many administrators now are providing some kind of report in terms of what percentage of the book they feel they have verified existence-wise, and which in a lot of cases hedge funds are 100%, because they get the custody statements from all of the brokers, only in areas like bank debt where that gets complicated. So I think and also on the business side, I think obviously hedge fund equity owners get a reputation for being publicity shy, or in most cases, in some cases not. I think they accept that it is part of what investors expect these days to tell them with some level of precision how much they have invested in the fund, because that's very important to investors, and to tell not only investors but also these days regulators how they incentivise people and how they avoid misalignment of interest. So I think in all those areas one can be cynical, or one can say progress has not been as fast or as great as would be you'd want in a perfect world. I think a lot of progress has been made.